talk to you about the overall project and then dip in and out of my notes, read bits of your own book back to you, and ask you questions about it.
Terrific.
Good.
Okay, so I'm going to introduce you properly here. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guests today are Philip. Now say Tubman for me. Taubman or Tubman?
Taubman.
Taubman.
Yeah.
At least you guys are brothers. It would be tough if one of you pronounced your last name differently. It'd be like, oh no, I'm totally screwed now. They can't agree on the name. But anyway, we've got Bill and Phil, and I'm going to introduce them properly now. My guests are Phil Taubman and Bill Taubman, and they are writers who have written a remarkable book on McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense back in the days of Vietnam. And I'm 73, so this was part of my life, and I remember who he was. Phil is affiliated with Stanford University Center for International Security and Cooperation, and Phil worked at the New York Times for nearly 30 years, where he served as Washington correspondent, Moscow bureau chief, deputy editorial page editor, and Washington bureau chief. And Will is the Bertrand Snell Professor of Political Science Emeritus at Amherst College. His book, Khrushchev, The Man and His Era, won the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award. Separately, they are the authors of many books. Together, they have written McNamara At War, A New History. And this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I'm Frank Schaeffer, and I would ask you to subscribe right now on YouTube and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and to my Substack commentary page, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com. You can also follow my new project, The Gospel of Zip, at gospelofzip.com or whatever, and I'll go into that later. So I read the book, and as I mentioned to you both before we started this, I did not get a hard copy, which I'm going to ask you all to hold up. So if you would do that now and just show the cover, McNamara At War, and can you just tell me what the subtitle and New History, what you mean by that? Is that you are uncovering things that have not been written about before, or you're just presenting this as a kind of a complete and new history of his life?
Bill?
Yes, we believe we have discovered things that have not been discovered before.
Yeah.
We discovered a secret diary composed by McNamara's closest aide at the Pentagon.
Mm-hmm.
He got access to letters to him by Jacqueline Kennedy, the president's wife, and
Yeah.
we have letters from his mother, that is McNamara's mother, to him when he was in college and in graduate school. We have letters from McNamara to his wife in the 40s when he was in the military and she was back home.
Yeah.
We have declassified documents from American archives. You want to mention anything else that I've skipped over?
No, well, I think we also had the benefit, thanks to the cooperation of fellow authors. For example, Paul Hendrickson, who did a wonderful book about McNamara called The Living and the Dead. It appeared in the mid-1990s. Paul very generously gave us all of his notes of the many interviews that he did, some of which never got into his book. And the same thing happened with Brian Vandermark and Peter Osnos, who worked with McNamara on his book in retrospect that was published also in the mid-1990s. And they too gave us voluminous transcripts of their interviews with McNamara, much of which never saw the light of day in his book. And finally, Errol Morris, the filmmaker who did the terrific documentary Fog of War about McNamara, gave us the transcripts of endless hours of interviews he did with McNamara. Again, many of which in that case didn't make it into his documentary.
Yeah, I'm going to pause here just to mention that Phil has an interesting black eye that is a result of a dermatologist taking something off. And by the way, for about a year, all my podcasts were in the same boat, but because I had to explain a big scar here where I had a skin cancer removed and it was gradually healing up. And of course, people were more interested in that than in anything else I was doing. So I'd have to say, well, you can see I'm using less makeup now and so on. So basically, our viewers are used to dermatological procedures. So
I have,
you're like in a great tradition here. Come back anytime with whatever else happens to your face.
I have to add that I did not beat him up. My younger
Yeah,
brother.
I was going to say, and I was joking earlier with you guys before we went on saying, now I know how it was with two brothers working together. Maybe it wasn't as easy as we thought. Before we get into the book, I just have some basic questions to ask you. Okay, so your brothers, you're both academics, you're both writers, you've both done interesting things. What was the genesis of this particular project? As in, here's everything we could write about individually, but let's get together and do this book. Why McNamara, and why not one of you be the author? How come it's a two-man project?
Well, let's go back to 2010 when I get a call from a fellow colleague at Stanford, David Kennedy, an esteemed American historian. And David said, would you be interested in writing a new biography of Robert McNamara? And I said, not particularly.
Yeah.
And David said, well, there's some really interesting new material that his wife, second wife, inherited
Mm.
when McNamara died. And she thinks it's the makings of a new book. And so I got in touch with Diana McNamara, went back to Washington in, I think, 2010, 2011. I made several trips, looked at the material. And indeed, there was some remarkable new
Mm.
documents there that fired me up to want to do the book. It took a long time because I had just started a biography of George Shultz, Ronald Reagan's
Sure.
Secretary of State, and I needed to get that done first. And then, as I was kind of gearing up to turn my attention to McNamara, I thought, wouldn't it be great to have a co-author, and who
Mm.
better than Bill?
Yeah. And so, Bill, when your brother called you, were you already kind of interested in this subject matter, or was it just news to you? And now what have I got to do, kind of thing?
Well, I knew a lot about it and I was interested, but the main thing that happened in my life, I had always been a specialist on Russia. I'd
Hmm.
written biographies of Khrushchev and Gorbachev, but by the time Phil called, I had run out of Russians I wanted to write about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Plus, Russia was, in 2014, invading the Crimea, invading Ukraine.
Yeah.
And by 2022, it was dangerous to go to Russia. I,
Sure.
if I went there, I'd risk becoming a hostage. So I was grateful to have the idea of a new project involving an American leader
Yeah.
rather than a Russian leader.
Yeah. A little safer ground.
Yes.
Now, I think the book itself, if you'll just hold it up again and read the title and subtitle, isn't it coming out September 23rd? Is that correct?
Yeah, next week.
Okay. So,
McNamara At War, A New History.
yeah, and we're basically on the cusp of the release of the book by Norton, I think. And as I said, I've read it and I have notes, and we're going to go into that. Um, Let me give you a little background on where I'm coming from that'll make our discussion a little better in terms of just who's asking you questions and my kind of angle. At 73, of course, I could have been drafted to go to Vietnam, McNamara's War, as it were. I had polio when I was 2, so I have an atrophied left leg. I still got my papers, but I was living in Switzerland at the time where my parents lived. They were both Americans. Um, many years later, my son John volunteered for the Marine Corps out of high school, and this was just before 9/11. And then he fought in Afghanistan twice, once in Iraq, came back, went to the University of Chicago, graduated, is married, lives across the street from me. I do childcare for his three kids. But what was interesting to me, to cut to a quote from your book, which I wrote next to it in my notes here, open. And of course, this comes from toward the end of your book, but as a Marine dad who sat at home and was fearful every time I heard the sound of tire on my driveway crunching the peace stone that I have there, wondering if it was two guys in dress blues come to tell me my son had been killed. Um, I did not go to Vietnam, but I went to war with a Marine in another war that we lost, as it were. And so I'm going to read a quote from the end of your book. More than any other political leader we can think of, Robert McNamara admitted his grave mistakes in the hope of helping others to do better than he did. But the final ironies of his life are that many who continued to pursue peace among peoples and nations and to help the least advantaged among us have been no more successful than he was. And that what has remained in the hearts and memories of his children may be warmer and closer than was the case during some periods of his life. And though that's from the end of your book, it's kind of a reason, in my mind anyway, the note I made was this is why this is an important book, because we have not learned the lessons of history. No life represents more the follies of the United States post-World War II that I've read. I think it's a great book. And in a way, it's very much ripped from the headlines because this merry-go-round of involvement globally, in which my son was involved, just continues apace. So basically, if you read your book, it's a case of deja vu, whether it's Vietnam and the rooftop and the choppers coming to take people out, or Afghanistan as we pull out and people are scrambling to get on those last planes. And so, one question I want to ask you both and then we'll get to the book itself. But if there's any two men that I've ever talked to who, because of your lives and your interests, whether it's Khrushchev or this book or McNamara, I think you'll have some good thoughts on this. And I just want to throw it open to you with one question. And that is, what is the underlying problem with American foreign policy in which we repeat the same mistake again and again and again, almost as a carbon copy of the time before? Because this has happened all the time in my life. My son fought in a war that ended the same way. Here we are again. And it just seems to me that you two gentlemen have looked at this one life that ended in tragedy, because McNamara really went down in flames personally because of his involvement. What are your thoughts on what I've just asked you?
I'll take a crack at that. If you look and try to explain America's wars, especially the recent ones, which fit the pattern you described, there are, of course, multiple sources of what we've done. And you could name what I would call impersonal forces that explain it. That is, for example, the American ideology, which is that we stand for freedom and democracy, and we are eager to bring that to the rest of the world. And when we try to do that, we often discover the rest of the world isn't ready for us, or that we don't understand the country that we're trying to help, or that we haven't planned carefully enough what we will do and how we will exit from the war. So there are impersonal forces which span decades and help to explain Vietnam and help to explain Afghanistan and Iraq. But there are also personal forces, and that is the behavior, the mindset of the individuals who lead the country and lead us into war, like John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, or at the moment, well, Mr. Trump says he's not trying to do that, but we will see what happens. And what our book does, it takes account of those impersonal forces, but it zeroes in on one man and what he was thinking and the mistakes he made, which helped to explain why we got into the war and stayed there. And in particular, we focus in on a paradox which the world hasn't really understood until now, which is that McNamara, who was a primary spokesman for the war and who advocated fiercely for its escalation, actually doubted that the war was winnable. And we wanted to bring the troops out. And so we follow the fact that if he had told Johnson what he really believed, which is that we could not win and we must get out, Johnson might have listened to him. And if Johnson had listened to him, thousands of American lives would have been saved, and probably hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese lives would have been saved. So a lot hinged on McNamara, even though there were these larger forces.
Well, that sort of answers a general question that I'll ask both of you too. And I know, Phil, you want to weigh in on the other question I just asked Bill, but there's sort of two basic views of history and mixes of all of the above. And that is the kind of great man theory of the individual, whether it's Winston Churchill or Adolf Hitler or Donald Trump or whomever, is the hinge of fate at that moment and everything changes. And then there's another view which sort of says, like that book, whatever it was, Guns, Germs, and Steel, that no, it's not the men and it's not the culture and it's not the religion, let alone the individual. There are these sort of massive forces at work. I don't want to pigeonhole you guys, but having just finished reading the book this morning, it seems to me that you both subscribe to, I won't call it the great man theory of history, but the idea that just what you were saying, Will, that, McNamara could have made a difference and didn't, had a truer vision of what was going on in Vietnam and did not act on it. But you give him some agency there. In other words, some of this can be laid at his door.
Well, I think a lot of it can be laid at his door, and I think I subscribe to some extent to the great man theory,
Mm.
having been a newspaper person in Washington and Moscow and
Yeah.
watched the great figures of the latter part of the 20th century,
Mm.
the American presidents, the Soviet leaders, and others. And you can't help from an experience like that to understand the
Yeah.
centrality of the personalities in shaping history. And in this case, McNamara was as Bill said, a very effective and
Mm.
vociferous advocate of escalation in Vietnam. And he doubted what the outcome would be,
Mm.
but the reality is that he pushed Johnson to expand the war.
Mm.
Uh, and what course would have Vietnam War had taken? Had McNamara spoken up, as Bill said, I think that would have changed the arc of history.
Yeah, and later, of course, as you have in the book, in some detail, he apologized, admitted he was wrong, and we have the same sort of thing after Iraq. I don't recall anybody apologizing and saying they were wrong, but isn't he a little unique in that sense of being who he was and actually coming clean at the end and saying, well, I was mistaken and I should have done what you just talked about, and that is not push so hard. I think he stands a little bit alone in that category. Is that the case?
Yes, I would say he does. I mean, how many times have you read a memoir by a former president or cabinet member who
Right.
spends much of his time talking about how wrong he was?
Yeah.
Memoirs are usually self-congratulatory, self-advertisements. This is very different.
Yes.
And furthermore, it's not just at the end of his life that he understood he was wrong.
Yeah.
He understood in the middle of the war
Yeah.
that he had been wrong when he tried to expand it. And so much of his life thereafter was a kind of effort to understand himself, why
Mm.
he had been wrong,
Mm.
to atone for his errors and mistakes, which he did after the Pentagon, when he left the Pentagon in 1968 and
Yeah.
became president of the World Bank until
Yeah.
1981.
Yeah. I'm going to dive into the book a little more closely here. And I'm not quoting page numbers because when I read on Kindle, they give me the page numbers, and when I read on a file, they don't. And of course, I don't have the book to hold up either. But with those handicaps, I'm going to go in and out and just ask you to explain some things which I find will make people who listen to this podcast interested in your book, and they're going to want to dive in themselves for a lot of reasons. But the vividness of what you have discovered and described comes through with some of these quotes I'm going to pull. McNamara's war was not only in Vietnam, he was also at war with himself. Our aim in this book is neither to bury McNamara nor praise him. So you've kind of already talked about that, but that bears a little more discussion because, again, the subject of your book is a one-off. He's very unusual. Winston Churchill had no self-doubts. Um, Presidential libraries don't have anything in terms of second thoughts about anything. Bush has never repented of or apologized for sending my son to Iraq for no reason. My son came back alive, fortunately, but a lot of people didn't. So, to me, anyway, in terms of all the memoirs I've read and or biographies, or histories. Your book stands alone because he stands alone in this one thing. So let's talk a little bit about his philosophical, religious, spiritual journey, whatever you want to call it, toward repentance. Was this something that, is this the kind of person he was, or was it simply the magnitude of the moment of history he was involved in and the way it completely blew up in all of our faces that changed him? Hubristic, self-confident, push forward, get us further into it, and then all of a sudden, by the end of his life, this is a broken man.
Well, what we did to answer your question, Frank, is we went back to the beginning.
Mm.
That is, we have chapters on his childhood,
Yeah,
on
which I
his
read.
time at Berkeley, on
Yeah,
his years at the Harvard Business School, in the military, how he became president, the first president of Ford Motor Company,
yeah.
who was not a member of the Ford family. We tried to trace
Mm.
through his whole life the evolution of these feelings
Yeah.
and thoughts, which would eventually explain the puzzle of why he behaved as he
Of who he
did.
was. Did he have, I may have missed this in your book, and forgive me if I didn't read this part closely enough and make a note from it, but having come from a conservative evangelical religious background myself, my parents were both missionaries, and I've moved on from that background, but I understand that kind of impulse. Um, was there any point where he sort of put together his own journey toward repentance, if you want to put it that way, in the context of what you would call a spiritual journey with a philosophical or a religious kind of impetus, or was it more simply the failure of the war? So the seeds you sow in the early chapters. Um, I'm just wondering, as you look at his history, was this someone who, was this did this have a religious connotation to it in terms of repentance, or was this simply, hey, we made mistakes, historical mistakes, for which I'm sorry because a lot of people needlessly died? I mean, how do you feel he felt about it?
If I might continue, Phil, with leaving you for one side to the moment. Uh, in his early, he was apparently quite religious.
Yeah.
I remember taking a long walk in Washington with his daughter, who
Mm.
said they went to church every Sunday, and McNamara took notes.
Yeah.
But you would never know that from his memoirs. He doesn't emphasize his religion. He
Yeah.
doesn't trace his later behavior to his religion.
Mm.
What did come through from those early chapters is that his very powerful mother, who was a kind of helicopter president in a pre-helicopter age, and was always at him to excel, to be the best. If he
Yeah.
came home with an A plus, with an A, she would say, "Why didn't you get an A plus?"
Mm.
That sort of thing. When he joined a fraternity at Berkeley, she joined the mothers committee of the fraternity.
Yeah.
But she not only pushed him to excel, she had very high moral standards.
Hmm.
She pushed him to be not only a Boy Scout, but an Eagle Scout.
Yeah.
She pushed him to be honest and the highest standards of rectitude. And
Mm.
I think the combination of this drive to excel, which took him to the top, and the sense of that he must not only do well, he must do good, were key to his later behavior, because he did reach the top
Hmm.
and tried to do good, and yet he felt he had killed people, tens of thousands of them, unnecessarily.
Yeah, I mean, some of that, there's a quote here that sort of fits with what you're saying. He was not only well into his 80s, he was depressed at the zenith of his powers as an archetypal American. And I'm synopsizing this, a leader in over his head who mesmerizes those around him. He struggled for nearly 3 decades to understand the folly of the Vietnam War and its lessons for the future. Quote, "We were wrong, terribly wrong," end quote, about Vietnam, he confessed in his memoir. In retrospect, um, he talks about the lessons of Vietnam and published in 1995, but his admission of grave error, virtually unprecedented in the annals of retired leaders, never came with a heartfelt apology for the war. So I just want to ask you to explain that bit. But his admission of grave error, virtually unprecedented in the annals of retired leaders, never came with a heartfelt apology for the war. Just explain that a little bit, because when I ran into it, that kind of stood out as an important thought there, and I'm just curious to have you expand on that a little bit.
So, I think it was an absence of looking his critics in the eye,
Yeah.
looking the soldiers who had gone to Vietnam and survived, and the parents and siblings and relatives of those who did not, looking them in the eye and saying, not only did we make tactical errors, strategic errors, misunderstood our enemy and other, reasons that he cited, but he never really stopped and said, this was not only a terrible mistake that we made,
Yeah.
but we need to apologize to the country about it.
Mm.
We took America into an unwinnable war, and we never should have done that. And I'm deeply, deeply sorry we did
Mm.
that. He never uttered those words, I believe.
Yeah.
And that's why, years later, there's a scene in the book that some of your viewers and listeners may remember, where years later he's on the ferry, to Martha's Vineyard, where he had a place,
Yeah.
for summer visits. An opponent of his, someone who hated him because of his leadership of the Vietnam War, accosted
Mm.
him on the deck and tried to throw him overboard and
Mm.
nearly succeeded.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's that kind of visceral hatred of McNamara that I think persists to this day, I'm sure,
Sure.
among some Vietnam veterans.
Yeah, and I wasn't going to ask this as a question, and I don't want to detour into this, but do you expect the reaction to your book in terms of some of the Vietnam vets who have not forgiven him, and or people from other points of view will become contentious in the light of your book, saying it's too sympathetic to him, and he doesn't deserve the attention? Will you pick up the kind of last bit of the comet's tail of the Vietnam thing
We,
here and get some feedback? And have you already, or do you anticipate that?
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, I hope the majority of people who read the book will come away feeling that they better understand McNamara and what he did.
Yeah,
The book is not at all exculpatory about him or Vietnam, quite the contrary.
yeah.
But I'm sure there will be some people who read it and say, well, you're too soft on him.
Yeah, you're insufficiently harsh. I'm going to dip in and out of a couple things which were news to me. Having been alive and around during the time, I remember the era. I didn't have any sense of kind of the background with the Kennedy family. Um, for me, it's always McNamara and Johnson more in my mind, what I remember from the headlines. How was it that the coldest Kennedy cabinet member became Jackie's warmest cabinet friend? What exactly did he do to earn her trust and affection? Just expand on that a little bit and explain that uh, angle of your book, because it's one that I did not foresee coming, and I just have a general knowledge about the era. I don't claim any expertise, but the involvement with the Kennedy clan and then his particular attraction to Jackie or her attraction to him and the way that folds into quite a bit of the story at a certain point in your book, I found very interesting, especially in the light of the fact of her philandering husband. There's a passage in the book, I forget what the story was, but at the very moment he's talking to her, in fact, Kennedy, the president, is off, arranging another liaison with some other woman. This was the era that this was all in. And you fold these two together, a little bit sort of not tabloid, but I mean, the human interest level of the Kennedy clan, the philandering men, McNamara, she being attracted to him, and then they become kind of special friends. His reaction to wanting to leave the Georgetown social scene, he doesn't want to be part of it. I just think that's a very interesting part of your book, unrelated specifically to the war, that I think readers are going to find very enlightening, but also just good slice of history that we didn't see. Um, can you talk a little bit about that, how that theme runs through the book? Because I found it very interesting.
Sure. And, it was a surprise to me, and I think to Bill, and will be a surprise to many readers. The two figures, Jacqueline Kennedy and Robert McNamara, on the surface couldn't look more polar opposite. Uh,
Right.
and the idea that they became very close friends is really a surprise. So what we discovered, and a lot of this comes from the letters
Mm-hmm.
that Jackie Kennedy wrote to Robert McNamara, that he left in the hands of his widow when he died, and that we
Yeah.
had access to. I think it began in a kind of playful way. One of the first letters she sent him followed a night at the White House when the Kennedys were hosting a dinner and dance. And McNamara and Jackie Kennedy were doing the twist,
Yeah,
a
sure.
lively dance of that era. Chubby Checker was the rock star who made it famous.
Yeah.
And so there they are, these two unlikely figures doing the twist on the floor, at the White House. And it got some press coverage at the time. And she wrote him a very playful note about it. She sent him a kind of cut out figures of two bodies doing the twist together with some playful comments. And so I think that was excuse me, the beginning of what turned into a much closer friendship. And I
Sure.
think she saw in him the aspect of McNamara that the public didn't see,
Hmm.
that Bill and I got a glimpse of and present in the book, which is the kind of softer side of McNamara, a lover of poetry and
Yeah.
literature, a man who felt very comfortable, apparently, in the company of intelligent women, and wasn't just in pursuit of their bodies, as some of
Yeah.
the Kennedy clan were. And so over time, the relationship grew. And then I think it was sealed in a powerful way
Hmm.
the day of the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah, and I've got a quote from that passage in there that I was going to get to. But what surprised me about this, because I've always been a kind of a fan of Jackie Kennedy and sympathetic to her. This is just off the track here, but speaking of my brush with fame there, in the 1960s, my parents, we lived in Switzerland, would vacation in Portofino, Italy every year, and this was before it was discovered. And one of my big moments there, even as a child, I knew this was a thing. Was Jackie Kennedy walking down toward the quay with a t-shirt on and a pair of shorts, nobody paying any attention to her whatsoever. What period that was at or what, but and what age I was, I forget, but I remember seeing her there and my mother saying, "That's Jackie Kennedy." And so that was my big moment. But I have always looked at her and in fact all what you might call the Kennedy women as kind of victims all the way up into the present era. One thing this family of men has always had in common as they have treated women very badly. And so to the extent that that part of the Kennedy clan's dysfunction intruded into your book so powerfully because of Jackie's friendship with McNamara, it kind of jumped off the page to me because as someone who comes out of that era, I've always been aware of the fact that, eventually you pity every woman who gets involved with a Kennedy, and with almost no exceptions. You have a quote in here in terms of just Kennedy's involvement as with the Vietnam era and leading up to Johnson. As President Kennedy grew impatient over time with Secretary of State Dean Rusk, he talked of putting McNamara in that post. According to Robert Kennedy, the president actually, quote, thought of moving in the direction that would get the 1968 presidential nomination for Bob McNamara to make sure his country was, quote, placed in the best possible hands. Again, that just jumped off the page to me, stuff I've never even thought about. What was that all about?
So, this goes to the whole McNamara set of relations with all the Kennedys.
Yeah,
So we've talked a little bit about the Jackie Kennedy relationship. He also had a very close relationship with Bobby Kennedy.
yeah,
And of course, after the assassination, Bobby was the heir apparent to his slain brother.
yeah,
Johnson knew that, and Johnson resented him and feared him. And then, as the war began to widen, thanks to McNamara and Johnson, Bobby Kennedy opposed it. And during those years, McNamara thought that he somehow could serve both the friendship with the Kennedys and his friendship and service to Johnson. So he put himself in the really impossible situation
yeah,
where he'd sit at the cabinet table or in the Oval Office and plot war strategy with LBJ. And then he'd get on the phone with Bobby or fly up to Hyannisport, the Kennedy compound, and tell Bobby, what they were thinking, what the what his own doubts about the war were.
Yeah.
So this added, I think, to Robert McNamara's stress. He's kind of trying to befriend mortal enemies in a way, and that's essentially all but impossible.
Do you think there was a kind of a naivete there by him in the sense that he was a more honorable person, if I can put it that way, in an odd sense of thinking, well, we're all on the same team here. These guys should be working together. And of course, they were not. And the Kennedys and Johnson had a very bumpy relationship, to say the least. But, do you think he underestimated that kind of competitiveness because he was not so much a politician, but, regarded what he was doing as a kind of a patriotic duty, or am I being over idealistic about his character?
Bill, why don't you chime in here?
Well, that's hard to know. I suppose he tried to reassure himself by convincing himself that what he was doing
Yeah.
not wrong, but rather, serving two people who didn't like each other, but in a way that would advance the general interest.
Hmm.
But obviously, to the extent that they understood what he was doing, they must have felt beneficiaries of the inside information about the other that he was giving them, but potentially understanding that McNamara was not fully to be trusted himself.
Yeah.
I would say one other thing about McNamara, well, McNamara and Kennedy and Vietnam.
Mm.
Before Kennedy died, he apparently had decided it was time to pull out of Vietnam.
Yeah.
But he wanted to postpone that until 1964, after he had won the next election.
Mm-hmm.
The reason was he didn't want to be accused of losing Vietnam.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, and that's very interesting because he believed that very strongly. And Johnson, of course, believed that even more. He
Yeah.
didn't want to be, he didn't want to lose Vietnam and be condemned by the right wingers in the United States for
Yeah.
doing. But look at what that means. It means Vietnam is a place where we must win, but we can't lose.
Hmm.
Yet we are losing, and therefore we must get out. But we can't do that without being accused of losing Vietnam by our political enemies at home. So the whole thing was very strange. They both knew, that is Kennedy and Johnson, that they probably were losing and should get out.
Yeah.
Johnson refused to accept that, and we don't know what Kennedy would have done had he lived, whether he would have followed his the line he was arguing with McNamara that we must get out, or whether he would have shrunk back in the end from that out of the same fear of being skewered in American politics.
Yeah. This theme, of course, runs through a lot of our history. Who lost China, who lost this, as if somehow, if we had just done the right thing, we wouldn't lose any of these wars. And, you saw the same thing in Afghanistan when Biden finally pulled out somewhat clumsily. But then, of course, everybody's saying, well, he lost it and so
Yeah.
forth. So that's one of our repeated themes that I kind of alluded to earlier in our
Yes.
in our talk here. Just moving on to something here. His wife Margie is saying, Kip and I can't thank the Kennedys enough for changing our lives. As he said the other night, how will we ever get unused to all this stimulation and challenge? Just explain that a little bit. In other words, what was going on in their life that suddenly the Kennedys were so involved? I mean, you've talked about the fact you didn't want to socialize in Georgetown and so forth, but what did she mean by that? Well, how did their lives materially change because of their brushing up to this glamorous group of
I
people?
think I think when they said they didn't want to be social, to to be caught up in the social whirl of
Yeah,
Washington, that was partly because they thought that would be a distraction from the important work McNamara would be doing. But I think that this also reflected their sense that maybe they weren't up to that kind of socializing. Maybe they wouldn't fit in with
yeah,
the social world.
with that
And
kind of
and
high-powered
yet
group.
and yet they were accepted into that world, both in Georgetown by the people who lived there and were in the
Mhm.
government, but most importantly of all, by the Kennedys.
Yeah,
They were invited to these seminars that Bobby Kennedy would hold at his estate in Virginia, and they were superb, especially Bob at these seminars too, of taking part in it. But we include in the book a vignette where a neighbor of the McNamara's came upon Margie McNamara one day on top of her car,
Yeah.
polishing her car, and asked, "How come?" And she said, "Because we're invited to the White House."
Yeah.
That shows how naive she was in a
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. I kind of a question. I'm going to get back into the book specifically, but I want to throw this to both of you again, just to get a little piece of your life experience here. Um, when you look at his story and then how he rubs up against Johnson and the Kennedys, these very different characters who then become involved in this lost war, um, and reflect upon the different nature of different slices of America, this very sophisticated Kennedy clan, or at least in their own eyes, very sophisticated people, on the cusp of culture who, listening to a lot of classical music, at least officially when they go to concerts or invite people to the White House, and then Johnson and so forth. Where did the McNamara's fit in? In other words, in terms of a type of an American, he's obviously very brilliant in terms of intellectual firepower, smart man, all kinds of demons that track all the way from his childhood forward, as you show in the book, in terms of trying to figure out who this repentant old broken man is. But where does he fit in the big American story? In other words, right now we're in the sort of Trump era, and you have the rise of the religious right, and now they're the people who vote for him, and the MAGA movement, and so forth. I have a lot of trouble correlating anything useful from our period right now into the past. In other words, I can't imagine any of these people, the Kennedys or McNamara or his wife polishing her car. I don't see how they fit into our contemporary situation. And I'd like you both to talk about the link that binds our little piece of history right now in 2025 to the moment you write about, which when I read your book feels like it's on another planet somewhere. In other words, as crazy as the Vietnam era was, I know this will sound odd, it was very sane and part of the flow of history that I kind of thought I understood until Trump got elected. And now I don't understand that history anymore. And I'm not trying to be clever here. I would love to hear what you guys think about where we are right now.
So, let me start with the issue you raised a minute ago about, where does McNamara fit in the kind of
Yeah.
texture of American society? And I think he fits into the sort of prototype of the American striver, someone who starts from a very modest family, uh, happens to be born with an intellectual bent and
Mhm.
gift, and capitalizes on that to rise through the ranks of American society. In the military,
Yeah.
during World War II, he played a mid-level but important role in, helping to run the American Air Corps, which was the Army Air Corps at the time. It
Sure.
later became the Air Force. Then he goes to Ford after the war with a bunch of his buddies from the Army Air Corps. And he rises up the ranks, becomes president of Ford Motor Company, just weeks before John Kennedy calls him. And why is John Kennedy
Mhm.
picking him to be potential Treasury Secretary, which was also offered, and then Defense Secretary? The reason is that when you looked at the American corporate landscape in 1960, you would probably select Robert McNamara as the rising star
Yeah.
in the executive suite of American corporations. So, in that sense, he's an American prototype.
Mhm.
And then, of course, he runs slam bang into a war which he was unsuited to manage, and that was his downfall. So, I think there is a sense of Robert McNamara as an classic American success story
Yeah.
uh, until Vietnam.
Yeah, and it's sort of, I mean, there's no parallel whatsoever, but it's the same sort of era. When you look at Nixon's rise and his success, same thing, kind of humble beginning, non-elite, and then moves up, comes out, and suddenly incredibly successful in some ways. What I would call sort of a bit of ordinary American history, unlike our own moment, which I really see as something different. I may be wrong about that, but I'm just,
Frank,
trying to place this.
I would add one thing. When Kennedy chose McNamara, he was listening to people who had gotten to know McNamara
Yeah.
capacities at Ford. And one of the things that attracted him was the fact that McNamara had been a different kind of
Hmm.
executive. He had chosen to live in Ann Arbor, Michigan, the home of the University of Michigan,
Yeah.
rather than Dearborn, where all the other executives lived. He had reached out to befriend professors in various fields, from economics to
Hmm.
literature at
Hmm.
the University of Michigan. So he thought he was getting a more cultured executive, somebody who was interested in ideas and poetry and music and all of those things.
Yeah.
McNamara was different in that
Yeah.
regard. And I just want to mention one speculation I have, which has to do with Trump.
Mm.
First of all, I can't imagine Trump ever picking McNamara for the very reasons that Kennedy did, because he was interested in culture
Sure.
and wanted to live in a university town. And this, Phil may disagree, but I imagine that if somebody like Trump had offered the defense secretaryship to McNamara, he would have turned it down
Yeah.
because he would have known enough about Trump, having read, as he would have read biographies of Trump. He might have talked somewhere along the way to somebody like Michael Bloomberg, the
Sure.
former mayor of New York, who thought Trump was a chump and a crook, as well.
Yeah.
So that's maybe I'm romanticizing McNamara in that regard. Maybe ambition would have prevailed. Maybe he wouldn't have been able to resist being Secretary of Defense. But my fantasy, it perhaps is that he would have.
Would have turned him down.
What do you think, Phil?
Well, I think you underestimate the power of ambition.
Yeah.
Well, we've certainly seen that in the Trump era. All sorts of people who you would say would not be there, to start with the entire Republican Party, and the lack of any kind of resistance, I think is a pretty good argument for the fact that, the lure of power. Yeah, going back to McNamara at the beginning of the thing, McNamara, I'm reading from your book, notice Johnson's quote, tone for action in Vietnam at the meeting 2 days after Kennedy's death. Less than a month after Kennedy assassination, McNamara headed to South Vietnam. His conclusion, quote, we should watch the situation very carefully, running scared, hoping for the best, but preparing for more forceful moves if the situation does not show early signs of improvement. So it just seems to me that, the overlap with the Kennedy era, as I read your book, I don't see that as two sort of distinct eras. I don't know whether people have tried to bail Kennedy out by saying he would have ended the war if he hadn't been killed. That's nice, but we don't know that. But it seems to me that, Kennedy and McNamara were already, there was a relationship there that, McNamara, right after is heading to Vietnam. I don't see this as two separate eras. I kind of see more of a seamless connection between Kennedy and Johnson when it came to Vietnam. Now, maybe Kennedy would have gotten out. I don't know, but just talk a little bit about that moment of transition after the assassination, where McNamara was and how all that worked out.
So let me make 2 points. The first is on that particular scene that you described. Uh, what followed in that meeting, it was very revealing about McNamara and not a particularly flattering portrait of him.
Yeah.
So, as you say, he comes back from Vietnam. He thinks Kennedy is forward-leaning about Vietnam, and he starts off by talking about, that we're going to need to increase our involvement there.
Hmm.
And to his surprise, apparently, Kennedy begins to talk in a very cautious way about
Yeah.
Vietnam and warns that, we send the troops off and then, they come back in body bags. And McNamara, in an instant, flips in that meeting uh,
Yes.
to take a much more cautious approach to Vietnam, and that moment captures an unappealing quality of
Hmm.
McNamara, which is his almost instinctive gut reaction to want to please his boss.
Yeah.
And later with Johnson, that gets him and Johnson and the country into a very terrible war.
Yeah.
So, but the transition was also from Kennedy to Johnson was traumatic for the country, of course. We remember that, but also for McNamara because he kind of idolized Kennedy, who had excused him for some of his early blunders as
Sure.
Secretary of Defense. And Kennedy lived this very elegant life. They entertained at the White House.
Yeah.
Pablo Casals, the great cellist, came to play in the White House.
Yeah.
There was this kind of wonderful, sophisticated, worldly environment at the White House. And then, bingo, in an instant, Kennedy's gone. And in
Yeah.
his place is this coarse, kind of rough Texas politician. And I think it was a jolt to everybody in the country. It was a real terrific jolt to McNamara.
Mm.
And later, if you fast forward to what his kind of thoughtful view of McNamara was much later of Johnson was much later in life.
Sure.
You see him talking about Johnson as a cruel, manipulative figure.
Yeah.
Uh, and I think he understood that at the get-go.
Yeah.
He bent over backward to please Johnson.
One thing I wanted to pull out of the book and ask you to explain a little more, and here's a quote that'll get you into it. The Republican Party platform called for, quote, carrying the war to North Vietnam, end quote, so to avoid, quote, Munich-like appeasement, end quote. And then later you have Strom Thurmond sneering, I'm terribly disappointed with your statement. When McNamara had talked, just talk a little bit about the role. We're talking about Democrats here, Johnson, Kennedy, McNamara serving their administration. Just talk about the pressure from the Republican Party and Republican leaders kind of standing in the wings, ready to say who lost Vietnam if there was any sign of quote unquote weakness. How did that all fit together with McNamara's trajectory and then the presidents he served? Because of course the Republicans were all part of this as well.
Bill, do you want to?
Well, I think that fear of Republicans attacking them if they lost or they left Vietnam was a constant reason why Kennedy and Johnson stayed in as long as they did and
Yeah.
even expanded. Uh, I think McNamara's attitude toward Congress was his private attitude, probably like a lot of people today, was these guys are jerks. I don't have to pay much attention to them.
Yeah.
But in fact, he did have to pay attention to them. And when he finally told them, this is in 1967,
Right.
what he thought that he was against expanding the war. Uh, when Johnson heard about this, he called McNamara into the Oval Office and thrashed him for
Yeah.
4 hours. And McNamara said, we talk about this in the book, I've never been subjected to that kind of behavior by a president.
Yeah.
The larger question, I guess, is what do we think of the United States being motivated in entering a war or staying in a war or refusing to get out of the war because of our domestic politics?
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, that's crazy. You're supposed to get into a war because your national interest is at stake or
Yeah.
because your ideals are being endangered, not because you're worried about Strom Thurmond.
Yeah.
Yet that's the way it works.
Well, it worked that way, of course, in World War II as well, in the sense that, Roosevelt's big battle was with the isolationists and Lindbergh and company. Speaking of the Ford company, Henry Ford and others who were not just on the anti-Semitic side of things, but also were again, domestic politics almost kept us out of World War II. And Winston Churchill spent the first couple of years of that war trying to make the case for involvement, where he was up against American domestic policy. So I don't know what period of American history we've gotten this right, quote unquote, if there is such a thing, but it wasn't any clearer at that period of our history either. So what is it about America as a nation, or maybe this is the same in all countries? Because obviously the French told us to stay out of Vietnam, that it wouldn't end well. They told us to stay out of Iraq, that it wouldn't end well. We don't listen to others, even when they know something, perhaps have a long colonial past in dealing with some of the countries we then blithely get into. But then in addition to which, is that peculiar to American history? How do you see that? Is that us or is that everybody?
Well, it's enough people to make it more than an accident. It's a tendency
Mm-hmm.
which arises in many countries, just as today we can see the populist wave washing into France and Germany and Romania,
Yeah,
Hungary, uh,
the
as
United
well
Kingdom.
as into the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not alone in this, but I don't frankly know enough about the details of, say, French politics or
Yeah.
British politics to be able to make a detailed comparison.
Let me jump to something in the book that I think people find jump right out the page here. McNamara had been seeing a psychiatrist since 2000, he told Diana, but he considered that another weakness that added to his sense of guilt. No one else was to know, especially his children. Don't tell my children. Nobody must know because it's shameful to go to a psychiatrist, he says. Again, this humanizes him um, in a very kind of moving way. There's an aspect of your book where you're reading it as a political history, and these figures like the Kennedys and Johnson, seemed in another universe to ordinary mortals like me. But then again and again, you bring it back to the reader in something like that, and all of a sudden, McNamara is a human being, and you feel for him. At least I did. And I don't know, between the two of you, as you wrote this, how you balanced the man and the history, because they're kind of two different things, but his loathing of psychiatry while indulging in it out of a personal need. I just found that very moving. Maybe you want to just talk about the man a little bit, as you came to know him through looking at these letters and these papers and everything else, and forget the great moment of history he was in, but just as a human being. How
Well,
did you finish this project feeling about him?
what I'd like to say, preface to that, is that we so often see the figures of that stature, whether
Yeah.
presidents or top advisors, doing their jobs or not doing their jobs, making mistakes or not making mistakes. And so much of their behavior is designed to conceal what this
Mm.
book reveals, which is to say their inner turmoil, if it's
Yeah,
there,
exactly.
their inner torment, if it's
Yeah.
there. Maybe it isn't there for many people, but it was for him. And I think one of the virtues of this book is that it suddenly unpacks the inner life,
Yes.
powerful man like McNamara, and we discover not only his virtues and his defects as a statesman, but we discover his torment
Yeah,
and his
exactly.
anguish, and which he goes to great lengths to hide, but
Mhm.
we reveal it. I think that to me is one of the exciting things about this book.
Well, also later toward the very end of the book, another very touching passage in terms of the humanity involved was the fact that he hadn't wanted to be buried. And then there's a whole story about, winding up at Arlington, and then there was the gravestone, and that's not the instruction he had left. Maybe you can dig into a little bit of that, because again, that's a humanizing kind of story that you don't usually associate with the quote great men of history.
Yeah, well, early on, that was, one of the things that propelled me into the project. Having learned early on that McNamara had specifically requested not to be interred at
Yeah.
Arlington National Cemetery, and that when Robert Gates, who was Defense Secretary at the time of McNamara's death, got in touch with the family to talk about having a major, Pentagon memorial service and probably burying him
Yeah.
at Arlington, the answer was clear: no, no, thank you.
Yeah.
And then Craig McNamara, Robert McNamara's son,
Yeah.
uh, fast forward now a few years, he gets a call from a buddy of his who says, "I'm at Arlington. I'm over near the Eternal Flame by the Kennedy gravesite, and there's this memorial stone here dedicated to your father."
Hmm.
And Craig McNamara, Robert McNamara's son, says, "What? I know nothing about that."
Yeah.
Uh, so, as you say, Frank, this kind of glimpse of the fractures in the McNamara family, if
Yeah.
in this case you're including his second wife, I mean, you know, she gave permission uh,
Sure.
for the memorial stone, and as we were closing the book, actually, we were saying in the book that he had made clear throughout his career he never wanted to be buried at Arlington, and she
Yeah.
sent us a letter, and it's in the book. It's an important point that we
Sure.
changed, thanks to her intervention at the very end. A letter he wrote in 1967 when he was still defense secretary, talking about the fact that he and Margie, his wife, wished to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery.
Yeah. Yeah. I just found those two things running through your book. By the way, hold your book up again. We haven't done it for a minute. I would be holding it up and promoting it, but I don't, PDF file doesn't do much for promotion. McNamara at War, A New History. Um, and, it's a really good read. And I want to emphasize to my reader that whether it's Jackie Kennedy coming into the story the way she does, or his humanity in both fearing and loathing his own need for psychiatric help, or this stuff about where he's buried or not buried, or markers at Arlington and so forth, you have really woven together the portrait of the man. And I want to say that my impression of the book was that it's about a lot more than McNamara. We happen to be living at a time of American history, or at least from my point of view, I'm trying to get my hands on anything that will help me understand our moment a little bit. Whether it's our repeated folly and how we go to war, or the cycle of power in America with the Kennedys and now the Trump family and all these clans that seize power and stay there for a while. I found your book a terrific slice of Americana in a way that I hadn't read anything like this for a long time. American Caesar, was a little bit this way with the MacArthur thing, but it was more, novelistic in a way. But I just felt that I came away from reading the book saying, oh, okay, I understand my country better, not just the story of McNamara and how he fit in with all these people. And again, I just found it very interesting how you wove in the personal without in any way, at least from my point of view, detracting from the overarching story of Vietnam and how we got into that mess. So I just think both of you, did a terrific collaboration here. It's a very well written book. And I just want to thank you because it was a really good read and has given me a lot to think about.
Well, we thank you for those kind words.
Yes, we do. We've enjoyed talking to you and
Me
learned
too.
too.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I'm going to ask you a favor. We will sign off here. I'm going to leave in just a moment. Thank you once again. If you would not go away, but stay for a second and talk to my producer, Ernie, for two reasons. One, we want to make sure we are linking to everything that will promote the book. So if he, whatever you can tell him about that, how to keep promoting it and what to do with it. And the other thing is we always ask our guests a favor. And that is having had a conversation with me and maybe seeing a little bit of my interest in things. Maybe somebody comes to mind, or some buddies, or another team of brothers or sisters who've written a book together that we ought to be talking to them. If you want to give Ernie any ideas for some guests, saying, hey, you may not know of this person or that, doesn't have to be famous, doesn't have to be an author, but someone that you think would be a good fit for this conversation to talk about where we are in history and maybe something interesting they've done, that would be great, because some of our best guests have come from other people who have said, hey, you ought to talk to so-and-so who has also done something interesting in some areas. So if you wouldn't mind sticking around for a second when I say goodbye and just talk to Ernie for a minute.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank.
Hey, Phil and Bill, this has been a real honor, a genuine pleasure. I'm thrilled to talk to you, having literally finished the book this morning. It's like, you say it there and it comes out here, and then all of a